Okay, so today, hello again, we are talking about the Russian expansion into Siberia. And I've titled this lecture, Toppling, Kuchum, and Crossing a Continent, Russia's Conquest of Siberia and Expansion Across Eurasia. And it's a super clunky title, but I did that because, sorry, it's a super clunky title, but I did that because I really do see them as separate endeavors. And I might just begin, as you know, I did my research on Siberia, and my first book, The Merchants, is my first book is The Merchants of Siberia, Trade in Early Modern Eurasia. And in the course of writing this book, I did my research in Siberia. I spent 2 years in Russia, much of which was working in Siberian archives. And so those of you who may have ever been to Siberia in season can appreciate it when I say, choose your course of research carefully. Because believe you me, when years later, I had the opportunity to visit the Alhambra in Spain, I visited the Alhambra, which is an amazing site where there is a Christian church inside a beautiful mosque from medieval Spain. It was a sunny day. The flowers were in bloom. I had this succulent paella for lunch with a little bit of Spanish wine. And as I thought about this, the historical site that the Alhambra is of this amazing medieval mix of of Christianity and Islam in this beautiful place, I thought, wow, what a deeply fascinating history and what a fantastically pleasurable place to live. And what a shame that I have chosen to do my research in Siberia, where the first time that I went to the archive on a June day, it was in a crowded bus where there were so many people on this bus that I had standing room only, and I couldn't bend down to swat the mosquitoes away from my ankles, no socks. And the next day, my feet were so swollen, I couldn't even put my sneakers on. I was like, never, ever go to Siberia in June. Um, the winter in comparison is fantastic. So take home point, choose your research areas carefully. At any rate, it was too late for me. I was already into Siberia, and it turns out there are a number of really, really fascinating things to say about it. Here, a map you've seen before is kind of roughly the territory that we're talking about. But Siberia as a territory is a moving target. I just want to show you this picture because when I was in Siberia doing my research, I spent much of my time reading documents that look like this. And this is a customs book from the city of Tobolsk from the year 1653. So what I pretty much did in Siberia was I sat there and I read all the government correspondence that went back and forth. That's why when there was a natural disaster, it was the job of the military governor to try and help provide for people. Again, limited resources, government couldn't do everything it wanted to, but it very much understood itself, that being its job. So this was kind of much of the evidentiary base of what I worked on. And kind of as an aside, because I haven't told you this before, I'll share with you that before I became a Russian history professor, I was a Russian history graduate student. But before I was a Russian history graduate student, I worked for a transport company in Russia in the late 1990s. So back in the 1990s, it was still just a faint notion in the back of my mind that I might ever study history seriously. And it was still that heady first post-Soviet decade. And so along with many others, Slavophiles, carpetbaggers, and many in between, I was pretty much part of the shock troops of capitalism that was working for a company in Russia, helping to bring capitalism to Russia that had abandoned its socialist ways. Well, Russia isn't socialist now, and nor is it capitalism in a free market sense of the world. Something else over the decades, a kind of managed economy has emerged. At any rate, leaving all that stuff aside, what I want to share with you is that in my job of being part of the shock troops of capitalism, and there, that's a riff on kind of a Soviet term of shock troops, but that people that would kind of do important hard work fit quickly. So I'm being a little bit ironic there. But while many of my people that had graduated college at the same time with me were starting to be involved in sophisticated and complex internet startups, I was pouring my sweat and tears into a startup transport company in Russia, which in the 1990s was complex in more ways than I can begin to go into now, which is sort of surprising and disappointing since people have been transporting things from A to B for millennia. And so when I think about this, if you had said to me when I started my book project that I would spend years reading old customs documents, I would have said not just no, but hell no. And the reason being that in my job as a transport company, one of the biggest challenges that I dealt with was Russian customs and trying to get things through and fill out the documents the way they wanted to. It was like death by 1,000 bureaucratic cuts. And so part of the reason when I left my job and decided that I would give Russian graduate school a go, one of the real animating push forces behind that was how sick I was of dealing with Russian customs. And so the irony that I then went on to do a dissertation and write a book that required me to spend more hours than anyone ever would want to admit studying Russian customs books is really beyond me. But that said, that's just kind of a preface. If you're ever thinking about devoting your life to the study of Siberia, let's chat. At any rate, the history of the history of Siberia, in large part from a Russian perspective, begins with this guy, Yermak, the conqueror of Siberia. But in order for us to understand what Yermak was doing in Siberia, we need to know about these folks. And I've shown you, I showed you one of their palaces already. And here are some more, not them, but buildings that they built. And that's the Stroganov family. So right here is a church that the Stroganovs sponsored that paid for the building of in Nizhny Novgorod along the Volga. It is the town from which the late opposition leader Boris Nemtsov came. And here is the Stroganov Palace. And the Stroganov family built in St. Petersburg. You can walk by it on Nevsky Prospect in the mid 18th century. And now, if you'll notice, the sidewalk is above kind of the floor level of that palace. And that's because there's been a sinking on the ground. So when you go, it's a museum and you can go into it and you go down to get to the ground floor. Lots of engineering challenges there in St. Petersburg. So the history of Russia's conquest in Siberia very much begins with the Stroganov, and they show us something important about what Muscovy is up to in the 16th century. Before we go into them, let me just remind you of the space that showing you a series of slides that you've seen before from Muscovy. This is Muscovy in the 16th century, and then it starts to spread across the Eurasian continent. It reaches the Pacific coast as early as the 1640s, and then will continue to gain further area until this is in the 18th century. It actually goes across and claims Alaska in 1741. which it will sell in the mid 19th century. Here is the Eurasian space, though, before the Russian, before Muscovy took control of much of it. And it was sort of, because there was so much nomadic activity in the southern steppe lands, and because this taiga forest, so by taiga we mean evergreen forest, tall trees, was just tremendously sparsely populated by various indigenous groups. This area doesn't get a lot of print time in history, so to speak, and the books coming off of printing presses in Western Europe and for a long time. But this is sort of the space that we're starting to talk about. And the space that I want to turn our attention to right now for a moment is the Siberian Khanate. So we know a bit about the Kazan Khanate, we know about the Astrakhan Khanate, we know about the Crimean Khanate and the Nagai horde that nomadizes in this area. And now I'm going to specifically talk a little bit about the Khanate of Siberia. If we were able to draw a map, and again, these maps are in large part fiction, there aren't really clear boundaries, but the territory, if this right here says Ruskое Zarstvo, and this is the Ural Mountains, this space just east of the Urals is what we'd probably call the Khanate of Siberia. And by that, we pretty much mean a place where someone who called themselves the Khan was collecting tribute, and largely fur tribute, from the indigenous peoples that lived in this part of the world, the Khanti, the Mansi, the Vostyaks, and some other groups. Now, this right here, this polity, if you will, of the Khanate of Siberia is what Yermak conquered. Now, let me come back to this Mongol map. And the Mongol Empire quickly split into 4 different Khanates. China, the Ilkhanate that became Persia, what became known as the Golden Horde or Russia, and the Chagatai Horde, which was much of Central Asia. The Siberian Khanate comes from this area. And we know the story of the Mongol horde fragmenting until it is almost entirely conquered by Muscovy. It fragmented pretty quickly, but left quite a mark. And the dynastic principle prevailed for centuries after that. Now, the Khanate of Siberia emerged from the Chagatai Khanate, and it seems to have moved somewhat east. Its territorial boundaries seem to have moved some over time to where it ended up in the 16th century as being east of the Urals. Now, in the Moscow conquered 1552, conquers Kazan, 1556, conquers Astrakhan, and then there's this question: is Siberia next? Is Russia already starting this rapid expanse? Well, as you know, not necessarily. Ivan IV was really interested in advancing on the Baltic, and he engaged in the Livonian War. And we don't see much of a movement to move eastward at all. After all, why would you? The real valuable trade route is here on the Volga, right? Emptying out into the Caspian Sea, a conduit into all the riches of the Orient. So we really, I think, I come down on this side of thinking we don't really have any reason to see Russia necessarily planning on continuing that expansion eastward, or do we? Now, Kachum in the 1560s, the leader of the Siberian Khanate was overthrown by another rival who was also a descendant of the Chinggisid line, so also a descendant of Genghis Khan, and his name was Kachum. Kachum, when he took up the leadership of the Khanate of Siberia, he paid tribute to Ivan IV. This is something his predecessor had done, and he contributed to do it. It seems that Kachum was something of an empire builder in his own right. He wasn't interested in being subordinate to Russia. He wanted to reunify territory, maybe in the sense that Tamerlane had in the very end of the 14th century. And he certainly wanted to collect tribute. He also wanted his subjects to be good Muslims, and perhaps he saw a real value in having his capital be something of a spiritual center. Remember how we talked about how the Muscovite grand princes built up the prestige of Moscow, by enhancing the things that made it a spiritual center? Seems like Kachum might have been up to a similar business. He sent emissaries to Bukhara, the shining city in Central Asia, to ask for spiritual leaders and teachers to come to his territory, sending Muslim clerics to teach his local population. He seems to have also sent emissaries to Kazan asking for the same type of assistance. Now, in 1571, Kachum's emissaries traveled to Moscow to deliver the tribute, as they had been doing in previous years. But when they arrived in Muscovy in 1571, they found that Muscovy was in total shambles. Remember that graph, that timeline I showed you before? Crimea sacks Moscow. Moscow had been sacked by Crimean Tatars. Thousands of buildings have been burned. Thousands of people had been captured. Much treasure had been taken from the city. And as you'll recall, Ivan IV is off somewhere as part of this oprichtenny, that he has split the realm. There has been massive purges and persecution, chaos and disorder. And that is what Kachum's emissaries find when they show up to deliver tribute to Moscow in 1571. Emboldened, Kachum decides he's not going to deliver any more tribute to Moscow. Why bother? These guys seem to be a basket case. And not long afterwards, the Tsar sends some emissaries out to Siberia, and the Tsar's emissary is murdered. Presumably, Kachum is not only saying, I'm not going to pay you tribute, but I'm the boss around here, and you're not welcome to just send any old emissary you like. Or, well, at any rate, even if that wasn't Kachum's intentions, it is really bad diplomatic form to murder an emissary. Like, as a general rule, there was this, you let the emissary take the message back. It's the basis of even hostile diplomacy. So in 1573, Kachum's brother, Mamet Kul, attacks some Russians, a Russian contingent. So this gives you some sense of this history. Like, we tell this history of the glorious Russian Empire growing. But I want to pause here to show that out in Siberia in the middle of the 16th century, there was a ruler, Kachum, who seems to have had a different idea, or an idea opposed to Russia taking over all of Eurasia, and had a vision of growing his own empire or larger polity of sorts. And so he backed off of a previous stance of being more deferential to Moscow. So enter Yermak. Here's a picture, again, a statue of what Yermak Timofeyev may have worked for. Yermak is the legendary conqueror of Siberia. The 18th century historian G.F. Mueller described him as, quote, nothing more than a fugitive Cossack of the dawn and a chief of a troop of bandits who infested the shores of the Caspian Sea. He's right. Yermak was a Cossack from maybe the Volga River, maybe the Ural River region. He had a contingent of hundreds of Cossacks that followed him. And much of what they did was raid ships along the Volga. They raided, they stole from Turkish ships as well. They also stole from Muscovite ships. And there was even not exactly a warrant out for his arrest, but a decree from Tsar Ivan specifically naming this Cossack, Yermak Timofeyevich, and saying that the Tsar wanted his head for his thieving, mutinous behavior. Yermak gets wind that there's a price on his head, and he takes his contingent of several hundred Cossacks, and they head northeastward into the territory where the Stroganovs have been granted a charter. So this takes us back to the Stroganovs. And he pretty much takes up work as being their kind of private security contingent. Think Blackwater. He doesn't work for the government, but the Stroganovs hire him to do their security. Now, the Stroganovs were there because they had been issued a charter in 1558 first, April 4th, 1558. Grigory Anikievich Stroganov was granted a charter from Tsar Ivan IV to, quote, all the inhabited lands, black forests, wild rivers, and lakes and uninhabited lands and marshlands in our patrimony along the Kama River. The Kama River is kind of this river in the near the Urals. Here's the Kama, and it goes. So their first charter was west of the Urals, and then basically they get a charter to develop land. And basically what it said was, you don't have to pay us taxes. Just if you find any valuable metals like ore and gold, or with which we can pour cannons, or gold, that is ours. Anything under the substrata, we have rights to substrata resources. If you find them, you let us know. And if you find, and this is interesting, there's no real clear articulation of serfdom in the 16th century or anything like that, but it says if peasants who come from somewhere else belong somewhere else come to you, we kind of would like you to send them back where they belong. But it's kind of toothless, and we no enforcement. But those were the kind of provisions that the Russian government said. But other than that, they said, set up your reign, develop this territory. Kind of like homesteading, develop this territory, make what earnings you can off of it, and you won't pay any taxes for a certain period of time. Kind of an understanding being at some point, maybe you would spend taxes. Then that charter gets extended in 1568. They get a charter for more territory, moving farther into the east. And then in a letter of 1572, it also they get more and more territory. So as the Stroganovs are the Tsar is essentially granting them territory that he doesn't really have, but saying, go ahead, develop this for us. You can keep the profits unless you find gold or minerals I really want. And as they do this, they start to come into contact with Kachum's people. They start to attempt to collect tribute from people Kachum is collecting tribute from. Kachum doesn't like that. And so they come into some conflicts that get violent even with Kachum's people. And it's in this context that they call up that they were like, well, we need some security concern, and they hire Yermak to be their security contingent. Now, in his writing of the Conquest of Siberia, G.F. Mueller actually wrote, this 18th century historian, he actually wrote that Yermak initially claimed the conquest as his own, as if he was going to set himself up as some sort of king of the territory. He, quote, seated himself on the throne until, but then backtracked on that when he found himself under the necessity of maybe calling in foreign assistance, because Kachum wasn't giving up easily. I'm getting a little bit ahead of our story. Now, many accounts say that when Yermak first conquered Siberia, he was furious at this kind of lone action. But he came around and was quite okay with it when Yermak, in subjugation, made the trip to Moscow, and he brought thousands and thousands of really precious, luxurious pelts to Ivan as a gift. And with this, Ivan forgave him and also honored Yermak himself with some gifts, including a suit of armor, the suit of armor in which Yermak reportedly died. And here is another image of Yermak. We really don't know what he looks like. And here is a really bad reproduction of a picture from the Remazov Chronicle that shows Yermak's prehistory, when he was down there plundering on the Volga and Caspian seas before he went into the service of the Stroganovs. Now here, another 19th century romantic picture I'll show you. Here's a very famous picture done by Surikov of the conquest of Yermak. And this was done at the very end of the 19th century. So here is, and I'll read to you a remark from Yermak's account. So, or sorry, I'll read to you a remark from Mueller's account, who wrote that, quote, "It is now sufficiently ascertained that the branch of the Irtish where Yermak drowned was a canal, which some time before this catastrophe had been cut by order of that Cossack, not far from the spot where the Vagai River falls into the Irtish River. The latter river forms a bend of 6 versts, and by cutting a canal in a straight line from 2 extreme points on this sweep, he shortened the length of this navigation." Okay, I just ruined the story for you, telling you how Yermak met his end, by telling you that Yermak met his end. He met his end, now I'm going to tell you how, when reports came in of a Bukharan caravan that just couldn't get through. Wait, I think there's something else that I didn't tell you as well. So Yermak is working for the Stroganovs, and then in the year, it's not quite clear. Some people say 1581, 1582, 1583. To be honest, I'm not entirely sure, but let's call it 1582 just for the sake of it. But so in the early 1580s, he takes his contingent of men out on a campaign. The sense being that they are starting to have increasing troubles with Kachum's men getting more aggressive. And so now they're gonna answer that with being a little bit more aggressive. So he takes a contingent and they go out and they fight Kachum's fight Kachum's armies, and even go for the town where Kachum lives. To this day, the ruins, we think we found it not too far from Tobolsk, but along the Irtish River. And in this 19th century painting, this is supposedly a skyline of it, probably pretty fictionalized. But they have this large encounter. Kachum flees. But he doesn't totally surrender. And if you'll recall something that I've mentioned to you about Tatar warfare, like in Western European warfare, in order to win, you take the city. But in a world more born of nomadic ways of living, to take a place doesn't constitute victory. It's to take the leader. And it's really remarkable how in the late medieval, early modern period, as one German scholar has argued, that when Lithuanian armies, for example, when they were dealing with kind of Europeanized people, they understood that it was taking the city was sufficient to win. But when they were dealing with Tatar armies, they understood that it's taking the leader. So with that kind of enriching whatever we think happened here, Kachum flees the city that he lives in with Yermak's army, but he doesn't surrender or admit that he's been deposed. And in fact, he continues to be a force moving around and kind of through rearguard action and other guerrilla action, whatnot, causing a problem to the establishment of Russian sovereignty until he dies in 1598. And even to this day, so in reading the Russian archives, there's I encountered about 20 different adjectives that would precede the word Tatar, depending on who these people were. And 2 adjectives that I would encounter in the archives were the descriptors Kuchumovi Tatari and Bolotnaya Tatari. And that means kind of Kachum's Tatars or marsh Tatars. And the idea being that often Kachum was in hiding in marshy areas where they couldn't get to him because you really can't move an army through a marsh. So it's a great hiding place, or just Tatars still loyal to Kachum. So it's a group that remains known and legible in documents into the 17th century to the Russian government. So this painting right here by Surikov is capturing that glorious conquest. But the point that I would make to you is that it was much murkier, and certainly this painting right here, if you'll note, all the Tatars just have bows and arrows, and the Russians are carrying guns. The weaponry probably wasn't that much of a mix. Both armies probably had pretty similar weapons at the time. And then as I moved ahead with this story, so what happens? Yermak kind of goes on this campaign, Kachum goes away, then he comes back, collects all this fur tribute from the tribute people while Kachum's people aren't getting tribute, collects a bunch of fur tribute, brings it to Moscow, and Ivan, who originally had been supposedly irate, all of a sudden is on board with what Yermak has been up to, grants him this gift, and Yermak goes back to Siberia to participate in the kind of claiming it for Russia. So now no longer a Stroganov project, but now this is going to be a Russian project. And it said that this here from the Remezov Chronicle, not the Remezov Chronicle, the Kongur Chronicle, is a picture showing Yermak's demise. So Yermak goes back to Siberia. And as I said, one of the things he's probably doing is building a canal, because the Siberian rivers and river valleys that would drain, they would have tremendous, an oxbow, that kind of big bend in a river. And here you see a picture of it. So for example, here you can see that if you just have a canal right there, you could navigate that river far more quickly. From the Mueller expedition, there's one place where it's remarked in the journal saying, we were on the water moving all day and we pretty much ended up where we started, just yards away. And the reason that could happen is because of these oxbows like here. So the record leaves us to think that probably one of the things that Yermak is involved in doing is building some sort of infrastructure. And it happened to be, from what the Chronicles tells us, that in that infrastructure is where he met his ends. And we know more about how he met that end. Here, I'll read you a bit from the Yesipov Chronicle, one of 3 chronicles about the conquest of Siberia. And the Yesipov Chronicle reads like this. It says, in the year 1584, maybe it was 1585, sent by the will of God, the hour was prepared to send death upon the warriors. News came from Bukharan merchants to Yermak and his men that Kachum would not let them pass into Siberia. Yermak, with a small band of warriors, went to meet the enemies along the Irtysh in canoes. When they had come to the Vaga River, the Bukharans were not there. So what this tells us is that Yermak and his Yermak, when they got word that there were some traders that were trying to come to the Siberian town to bring goods and trade goods, Kachum isn't letting them through. They really wanted traders to get to Siberia. And so Yermak and his men went to help escort those traders. And this, for me, kind of coming, full disclaimer, in the Merchants of Siberia, one of the main themes in this book is how much the Russian government wanted people from Central Asia to get through with their goods and be able to trade in Siberia, because it recognized that people bringing commerce to the area was really good and could help supply an area that the Russian government was as yet not able to supply. And so it doesn't surprise me that when Yermak got word that traders wanted to get through and couldn't, he understood it to be his duty to go and help them get through. Well, when he got there, it turned out it was all a ruse. And instead of finding traders, they found nothing. And they made camp on an island in the night. And then in the night, they were attacked by a band of Kachum's men. In the chaos, it is said that Yermak tried to flee and fell into the river in his heavy armor and drowned. That is, and so that is the story of how Yermak died. He was done for, but the Russian conquest of Siberia is just getting started. And Russia starts making settlements all across Siberia. It settles Tyumen in 1586, Tobolsk in 1587. We have Losva, Pelim, Berezov, Tara, Surgut, Narim, Verkhator, Turinsk, Mangazea, Katsk, Tomsk, New Mangazea, Kuznetsk, Yeniseisk in 1619, Krasnoyarsk, Bratsk, Yakutsk, and they reached the Pacific coast. So you just all these settlements, they're 1607, 1618 in Krasnoyarsk, more settlements. I'll just kind of move through, show you this visual quite quickly. And they get here to Udansk in 1630. They get the mouth of the river Utsk in 1639. They found Ukhotsk in 1649 up there, and then also follow Irkutsk, Nerchinsk, and as this map shows, by the mid-17th century, Russians have moved all across Siberia. Actually with that, so that we can wrap up on time, we'll stop talking. That's sort of the story of the initial conquest. And then I'll talk to you next time a little bit more about, in a little bit more detail about the expansion across Eurasia and what Russia gets out of it. Let me close by making 2 points. Point number one is that here drawing on a way that the historian Val Kivelson first put it to me, is that you might think, when you think of the growing Russian Empire, think of Swiss cheese. You know, we can draw a map and just paint all Eurasia Russian, but really what I think is a more appropriate way to think of it is that these dots are settlements that the Russian government built, and they immediately built forts and buildings around them. Those fortresses were called ostrogs. They might have looked something like this, always fenced immediately. Pretty much they built a fence and a church to all the settlements. Security was always a really big consideration. And for much of the 17th century, Russians probably didn't comfortably go too far beyond the walls of those settlements, feeling entirely secure. For example, in my documents, I see time again instructions saying, you know, go here and do this. And I get an answer back saying, we can't go there because Kalmyks are there and they'll kill us. And so, and these are even territories that technically we would draw the Russian map and see it here as uncontested Russian territory. But in reality, Russia's sovereignty over this area was much more porous and maybe better to think of as Swiss cheese. There were still lots of places that they couldn't go and state power didn't extend. That said, this is very much a project of conquest that we will watch play out. And the second point that I want to make, because next week we're also going to be talking about the time of troubles, is that back in the center of Russia, we are going to see essentially a period of state collapse. And yet, even in the midst of that state collapse, although it pauses and limps a bit, this project of expansion across Siberia continues more or less apace. They'll found Mangazea in 1600, Ketsk in 1602, Tomsk in 1604, New Mangazea 1607. Then we do see kind of a real break before Kuznetsk is founded in 1618. But what I'm struck by is that even in the midst of total state collapse, this eastward expansion across Siberia continues. And with that, I will end.